And we are back. Yesterday, the Wisconsin Supreme Court heard the arguments in the redistricting case. And fur was flying. That's a nice way of saying things got pretty heated in the courtroom, at least according to some of the transcripted comments at WisconsinRightNow.com. Rick Esenberg from Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty joins me on the program. You had Rebecca Bradley, just at least in some instances, really take it to the plaintiffs in this case. At the same time, you know, as much as I agree with what she said, which is essentially you're bringing this case because the Justice Protasewicz, campaigned on upending these maps. That's the reason you're bringing this case. That's true. But does that mean that it's going to help at all? So let's kind of, you know, spitball what's going to happen. What's the likelihood of happening? That's going to happen in this case?
Well, it absolutely is true that strong feelings were expressed. But the thing that you have to keep in mind about a hearing like that is that it really is an opportunity for the lawyers to try to get to four. That is, they need four justices to accept their position, or at least part of their position. And a lot of the heat that you see is very, very interesting, but doesn't really tell you what's going to happen, and sometimes is, maybe most of the time, is not particularly helpful in trying to move the majority to a good result.
All right. So, and I agree with you on that. I don't think Rebecca Bradley, necessarily thought she was going to move the majority. Maybe she did. I'm hopeful. She was expressing her views, and that's fine. I mean, that happens too. Right. So the bigger concern I have is that what this case does, it upends the maps, and it forces people, some of whom ran for their elections last year, it forces people to run for re-election. So we're all talking about democracy. This is lighting a stick of dynamite under democracy, because you're essentially telling a whole bunch of people that their vote didn't count. And nobody seems to want to talk about it that way in the press, but that's what they're trying to do so that they can control the maps and take control of the legislature and overwhelm the elections coming up in 2024 by making them also about state elections.
Right. So I think that there are three things going on here. One is that the petitioners in this case, and those would be what we typically call the plaintiffs, the ones who brought the case, they're saying that they want to do over the 2022 Senate election. So normally we elect senators to the state legislature. They have 4-year terms, so half of them are up, every time. They want to have them all be up. And that would undermine our Constitution, which deliberately chose to give senators these 4-year terms so they would have a longer perspective. They wouldn't constantly be running for re-election. And so there is some disenfranchisement involved in that. And if you're really a promoter of democracy, you have to think long and hard about what circumstances would justify that. And I don't think they're present here. The other two things that you have to keep in mind is that promoting democracy, a lot of times what we hear from people, well, this is just about having elections. Democracy is just about having elections, but it's not just about having elections. It's about having elections in the way in which we, as a democratic republic, have chosen to have them. That's embodied in our Constitution. Our Constitution provides for single-member geographic districts, right? There are other legislators like Israel's Knesset that they don't have that. They have at-large elections, and so they elect so many of this party, so many of that party, and that constitutes a legislature. Here we elect people that are from somewhere, from particular districts. And so when you go into court and you ask the court to adjust the lines so that the outcome of the 99 assembly elections and the 33 Senate elections that we do hold match the aggregate number of people in all of these races who voted for Democrats and Republicans, that's an election we don't hold. And there's no reason to believe that the two will be the same, because if you have, as we do have, Democratic voters who are more highly geographically concentrated than Republican voters, they won't do as well in single-member geographic districts than they would in this at-large election that we don't hold.
Yeah, and the Milwaukee area wants to draw its excess population because it's wasted in their mind. It's so concentrated with Democrats. Madison's the same way. It's so concentrated with Democrats. It's a waste. So let's share our excess leftism with other districts, which is why they want to be able to redraw those lines. It's essentially saying we want extra representation for Madison and Milwaukee.
Yeah,
and that's what they want. And yet they're screaming fair maps, fair maps. Fair maps to them means having Milwaukee and Madison and the denser urban areas of Wisconsin put their thumb on the scale. That's what fair maps means to them.
You're right. They use the term wasted votes, which has no meaning in single-member district legislations. I mean, legislatures where, yes, if all of your voters are concentrated in, to use an extreme example, 20 districts or 25 districts, then, right, you may do better in an at-large election than you will in a districted election. But our Constitution chooses the latter. It chooses the districted legislation. And so votes that are cast in a single district are not wasted simply because the winning candidate, gets a very, very high percentage of the total.
Yeah, or because the losing candidate's a Democrat. Doesn't mean your vote's wasted. The districts are important. I've got a little bit of time here. Why did we decide that we want people represented in districts and then by people who live in those districts?
Same thing as the House and the Senate. It was an assumption on the part of the people who framed both our national and our state constitution that it matters where people live, that people have different interests based upon where they live, and that they're entitled to be represented on that basis. That this isn't just, people are not just faceless Democrats or Republicans who just want a generic Democrat or Republican to hold office. They want somebody who will be responsive to the concerns that they face where they live. And so while we absolutely have a democracy where the majority rules, we also elect representatives, the majority rules, within a district. So it's the job of that representative to be responsive to the needs of that district. And
because suburban...
this is not something that nobody thought of before. This is not a bug. It's a feature. Our framers were very, very concerned about, geographic breadth and about, having institutions of government that were responsive to the interests of the various parts of the country, or in our case, the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah, suburban voters do not share the same collection of interests as urban voters. Rural voters don't necessarily share the same collection of interests as suburban voters, et cetera. One last thing, the left loves to point to, say, the Milwaukee districts, and they say, look at the weird lines. Those are not compact and contiguous. Look at those little weird lines, forgetting to bother to mention that those municipal boundaries were drawn by Democrats.
Well, there's a couple of things going on there, too. In Milwaukee, you also have the operation of the Voting Rights Act, which is something that sometimes imposes an obligation to create majority-minority districts so that Black and Hispanic voters have an opportunity to elect the candidates to the choice, and that's part of what leads to things looking like that. But to be honest with you, districts in Wisconsin don't look that strange. There are many, many districts in many, many places across the country that look far stranger than the ones we have here in Wisconsin.
Now, they just want to scream about gerrymandering because they understand that most people don't even know what that is. In terms of where you can go after this, is this tied to the Wisconsin Constitution? Is this something that could be appealable to the United States Supreme Court? Are we going to be stuck with this if it goes badly?
Yeah, it kind of depends what happens. I think that the petitioners here have set it up to be state law only. But, in the last redistricting, the case did wind up going to the United States Supreme Court and it reversed what the Wisconsin Supreme Court did on legislative maps. And so it kind of depends on what happens in the next phase. What we're going to see now is we're going to see a decision from the court, assuming that they think that there's some kind of constitutional violation to be remedied, then they may or they may not set rules for, proposals for new maps that go forward. The new maps will be proposed, and they'll have to pick one. And kind of depending upon what happens at that phase of the proceeding, we'll see whether or not there's a federal issue that would warrant U.S. Supreme Court review.
And it also will determine whether this thing gets done really, really fast, as in before 2024 or not, correct?
Yeah, I don't really think, realistically, I don't think there's any way this gets done in time for the 2024 election. And although the petitioners asked that, there be do-overs of the 2022 Senate elections, I don't think that's going to happen.
Rick Esenberg, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, thanks so much for jumping on today.
All right, thank you. Take care. Happy Thanksgiving.
You as well. Happy Thanksgiving. We'll be right back.